The family was happy. The king was good, the queen was gentle and clever, and their 7 children tumbled through the palace and its gardens with the easy, cheerful energy of people who are loved well and know it. As the princes grew older, the palace began to feel too small for them. It is the nature of boys of a certain age to want to go further. Past the garden, past the walls, out into the wider world that sits just beyond what you can see from the highest window. The king and queen understood this perfectly because they had been young once, and they allowed the boys their adventures in the forest that surrounded the palace grounds. The princes loved it. They would disappear into the trees for hours, returning at dusk mud-streaked and triumphant, pockets full of interesting rocks and fallen feathers and other things. Their mother would look at with a mixture of affection and despair as she sent their trousers to be cleaned for the 3rd time that week. She did not really mind. It made her happy to see them so alive. May was too young to go with them. She was left behind in the garden, a garden she knew perfectly. Every corner of it, every flower bed, every path. And some days, it felt as though the whole wide world was happening just beyond the wall, and she was missing every bit of it. One afternoon, the princes set out, as usual, and followed a path they had never noticed before. The eldest had spotted it entirely by chance while stopping to retie his shoe, a narrow track winding away into the undergrowth where no path had previously been. This sort of thing is an irresistible invitation to 6 adventurous boys, and they were down it without a second thought. The track wound deeper into the forest than they had ever gone. They did not notice how deep. The trees closed overhead. The light thinned. The birdsong changed its character from the cheerful close-at-hand twittering of the familiar forest to something more distant, more echoing, more strange. Eventually, the track opened into a clearing. In the clearing was a cottage, small, moss-covered, with smoke curling from a stone chimney and a large black crow perched on a wooden stool outside the front door, regarding the new arrivals with the unimpressed intelligence that crows have always shown toward things they have seen coming from a long way off. There was a pile of feathers in the garden, enormous white feathers. Beautiful ones, the kind that might come from a very large and remarkable bird. The princes gathered around them to look. They were extraordinary. Each one longer than a forearm, soft as cloud, glowing faintly in the dappled light. The door opened. An old woman stepped out. She looked at the princes without warmth. "I don't care for visitors," she said. "State your business." And then she noticed which of the princes was reaching for the feathers, and her expression changed. "Don't touch those," she said. And there was something urgent in her voice now that had not been there before. "You will be sorry. Too late." The princes closest to the pile had already picked up feathers. Curious, innocent, harmless, and in the moment after the old woman spoke, something happened that none of them could quite explain afterward. A stillness in the air, a pause, as though the world had taken a breath, a sensation that started at the fingertips and moved. When the other boys looked, 2 of their brothers were no longer standing in the clearing. In their places, 2 white swans stretched their necks and ruffled their wings with the bewildered agitation of people who have just woken up somewhere entirely unexpected. The remaining princes looked at each other. The old woman was opening her mouth to say something. Her expression had shifted again into something that might have been regret, but they were already panicking. And in panic, people do not always make considered decisions. They grabbed the remaining feathers. In moments, the clearing held no princes at all. 6 white swans rose in confusion, circling once over the old woman's garden, dropping a few white feathers, and then flying away into the forest in the direction they had come from, unable to go back, unable to explain what had happened, and utterly unable to find their way to the palace in a form that anyone would recognize. They did not return home that night, nor the next. Search parties were sent. The king ordered the entire forest searched, and nothing was found. The tracks went cold. The princes were simply gone. Their mother stopped eating properly. She lay in her chamber and looked at the ceiling and was inconsolable. The king spent his days in council receiving reports from searchers who had nothing to report, and his nights sitting alone in the room that had always been the loudest and most alive in the whole palace. The room where his sons had played and argued and laughed and left their boots in the doorway. May was left entirely to her own devices. She wandered the palace corridors and the garden paths. She watched her parents diminish with grief and felt helpless in the face of it. She was too young to join the search parties. She was too old to pretend nothing was wrong. She missed her brothers with a specific particularace, the kind that is not just sadness, but also a sort of restlessness, the feeling that something ought to be done, if only she could work out what it was. One afternoon, many months after the princes had disappeared, May was sitting on a bench at the far end of the castle garden. She had brought her needlework, a project her governess had set, some tedious piece of embroidery, and had promptly abandoned it on the bench beside her, distracted by the warmth of the sun on her shoulders and her own wandering thoughts. And then she felt a small movement beside her. She opened her eyes. Sitting on the bench next to her was a large black crow. It was looking at her with extraordinary intelligence, the kind of gaze that makes you feel you are being assessed and found, on the whole, acceptable. At its feet was a ball of yarn, golden yarn, perfectly wound, catching the sunlight and throwing it back with a faint, warm shimmer. May held very still. The crow regarded her for a moment longer. Then it spread its wings and rose smoothly into the air, flying away toward the forest, and was gone. She looked at the yarn. She reached out and picked it up. It was soft in her hands, softer than yarn has any right to be. And as she turned it in her palms, it seemed to shift slightly in the light, as though something small and alive lived inside it. She turned it once more, and it rolled off her fingertips, unraveling quickly, and began to roll along the garden path. May grabbed the end of it and followed. The ball rolled with purpose and at a consistent pace, not so fast that she lost it, not so slow that she could catch it. Down the garden path, through the gate in the garden wall, and then out onto the forest track. She rewound the yarn as she went, following the thread that was already laid out before her, over roots and under fallen branches, between mossy boulders and across stepping stones in shallow streams, deeper and deeper into the forest, until the trees were tall and close around her and the birdsong had changed its quality, and the light was filtered green and golden and ancient. She did not notice when the last of the daylight began to thin. The yarn ball rolled up and over a small wooden bridge, and May followed, and on the other side of the bridge was a hollow, a small, sheltered, somehow warm and cozy place under very tall old trees. And in the center of the hollow was a cottage, neat, small, simply made. 6 windows, a wooden door. The Johann rolled to the door and stopped. May wound up the last of the thread, tucked the ball into a pocket, and knocked. No one answered. She pushed the door gently. It swung open. Inside was a single room, 6 beds, a table with 6 chairs, a fireplace with the last warmth of old embers still glowing in it. Everything tidy, everything simple, everything sized for grown men who did not have an enormous amount of stuff. May stood in the doorway. She was more tired than she had realized, and the bed nearest to her looked incredibly welcoming. She told herself she would only rest for a moment. She was asleep before the thought was quite finished. She woke to a sound outside the cottage, a rushing, worry sound, the sound of many large wings. She sat up in the dimness of the room. The fire had gone cold. The light outside the window had turned the dark blue of just dash past dash sunset. She went to the window. In the clearing outside, 6 enormous white swans were landing. They touched the ground gracefully, and as each one did, something remarkable happened. Wings folded, white feathers dissolved, and where there had been a bird, there was a young man. May put her hand over her mouth. Her brothers, she had found them. She burst through the cottage door, and they saw her at the same moment. And there was a moment of pure, frozen astonishment. And then they were all talking at once, all of them, reaching for each other, laughing and crying and pressing foreheads together the way families do when they have been kept apart too long, and the relief of reunion is so enormous, it has nowhere else to go. They built a fire. They sat around it in the small, warm space of the cottage, and her brothers told her everything: the clearing, the old woman, the feathers, the enchantment that turned them to swans with each sunrise and restored them at sunset, the house they had built in the forest to hide what they were, the careful, heartbreaking choice not to return to the palace and cause their parents further distress when there was no solution to offer. But surely there is a way, May said. There has to be a way to break it. Her brothers looked at her and then at each other, and then the eldest drew a breath and told her. The old woman had said before they flew away that she could not reverse what had been done. But there was one possibility. One person might be able to break the enchantment, a mother or a sister. Tell me, May said. Her voice was quiet, but it was steady. Tell me what I need to do. You must sew a shirt for each of us. The eldest said slowly, made only of daisy thread. And from the moment you begin until the final shirt is complete, you must not speak. Not a word. Not a laugh. Not a single sound. If you break your silence even once, the enchantment becomes permanent. Mai was quiet for a moment. How many shirts? She asked. 6. 6. The word settled over the room. 6 shirts, made of flowers, in absolute silence. For however long it took, 4 months, possibly, perhaps longer. She thought about her brothers. She thought about her parents. She thought about the leather workers, cottage she had once visited in a story she had been told about the suitors and the castle and the tests, and then she realized she was thinking of herself, sitting in this cottage, and the choice was actually very simple. "I'll begin tomorrow," she said. And this was the last thing she said for a very long time. In the morning, her brothers were gone with the sunrise, transformed as the light grew and the birds woke, flying away into the high air above the trees. They had left food for her and the knowledge that they would return. May sat on the cottage step with the golden yarn ball in her lap and thought about Desi's dot. She dropped the ball on the ground. It rolled, as it always did, with quiet confidence, and she followed it through the forest, not winding it up this time, leaving the thread laid out behind her as a trail back home. The ball brought her to a sunlit meadow absolutely spangled with wildflowers, daisies by the thousand, white and gold and nodding in the warm summer air. She gathered them with both arms until she could carry no more, then followed the thread back through the trees. She sat at the table in the cottage. She sewed. She had paid enough attention during her sewing lessons to know how. She could not make thread from the flowers in any conventional way, but she found slowly a method pressing the stems together, binding them with tiny, careful stitches, building something one infinitesimal connection at a time. It was painstaking. It is slow. There were days when she sat for hours and produced what seemed like nothing at all. But she did not stop. Days became weeks. The summer deepened around her. Her brothers brought her food and comfort, a ribbon for her hair, a warm cloak when the evenings began to cool. Stories told in the firelight while she listened and sewed and smiled and said nothing. When autumn came, the leaves in the clearing turned amber and copper and fell in spirals around the cottage. The familiar black crow appeared sometimes and sat with her in companionable silence on the cottage step. She found this comforting in a way she could not explain. Winter arrived. Snow fell. The world went quiet and white, and she sewed by firelight, and the days were short and the nights long, and she made the most of every hour of light. The first shirt was completed on a cold February morning, almost exactly 1 year after she had begun. It had taken a year. She had 5 more to make. She gathered fresh flowers in the spring and began again. The second shirt was done by the following June. The third by the June after that. 3 years, and she was halfway. During this time, May changed. She was no longer a girl. She was becoming a woman, quiet, self-possessed, with something in her eyes that had not been there before. A particular quality of patience, of knowing what she was doing and why, of having chosen a difficult thing and continued with it long past the point where someone else might have stopped. She did not regret her choice. Some mornings she missed her voice as you might miss a tool you have had to put away, simply noticing its absence, wishing it were available. But she did not doubt herself. One afternoon, in the 3rd year of her task, she was sitting in the branches of a tree near the cottage when a sound appeared in the forest, the sound of horses and voices and the gentle ringing of harness. She froze. Into the clearing rode a small party of finely dressed riders, 3 men and 2 women, on beautiful horses, dressed in velvet and colors that she had not seen since the palace. They stopped when they saw her. The man at the front of the group on a white horse. Clearly, the leader looked up at her with a carefully neutral expression that nonetheless contained a certain amount of concern. "Excuse me, miss," he said. "Do you live here? Are you here alone?" May looked down at him. She could not answer. He asked again, gently. She nodded to the first question. She could say nothing to the second. There was a quiet discussion among the riders. Then the man on the white horse looked back up at her with the expression of someone who has made a decision. "You cannot stay here alone," he said. "Come with us to the castle. You'll have proper rooms and company and safety. I cannot, in good conscience, leave you here." May thought rapidly. She had no way to explain, no way to refuse without speaking. And they seemed very certain. She looked at the cottage, at the work she had half finished, at the life she had built here, and she made the only calculation available to her. She climbed down from the tree. She gathered the 3 completed shirts and her needles and thread, and she put the golden yarn balls safely in her pocket. She allowed the man on the white horse to help her up in front of him. As they rode away and the trees closed over the cottage behind her, she felt the loss of it like a physical thing. Her brothers would return at sunset, and she would not be there. They would not know where she had gone. They would not know if she had given up. She had not given up. She clutched her shirts against her chest and rode in silence toward whatever came next. After a long ride through the thinning forest and then through open countryside, a walled city appeared in the distance. A castle rose at its center, handsome and solid. As they rode through the gates, she learned, by the way people bowed and stepped aside and addressed him, that the man who had insisted on rescuing her was not a lord or a courier, but a king. He seemed unfazed by having brought home a mysterious, silent young woman from the depths of the forest. He simply gave instructions that she be given rooms and whatever she needed, and let her settle in at her own pace. The castle had gardens. The gardens had daisies in abundance. May began the 4th shirt within a week. She became a fixture of the castle, the strange, lovely, silent woman in the best rooms, who spent all her time sewing what appeared to be shirts made of flowers, and who never spoke a word to anyone. The court was baffled. The servants were endlessly curious. But no one was unkind to her because the king had clearly taken an interest, and because there was something in her manner, steady and unhurried and quietly determined, that commanded a certain respect even from people who did not understand it at all. The king himself came to sit with her, sometimes on the veranda, in fine weather, or by the fire in the evenings. He did not push her to speak. He did not ask questions she could not answer. He simply kept her company in the most straightforward and decent possible way, and she appreciated it more than she could say, which was, of course, exactly nothing. A year after she arrived, he came to her on the veranda and knelt beside her. "I don't know your name," he said quietly. "I have never heard your voice, and yet I find I have fallen entirely in love with you. If you feel something for me, will you break your silence just once and tell me?" May stopped sewing. She looked at him. She let him see her face and whatever was in it, the truth of what she felt, and the truth of why she could not yet say it. She picked up her needle again. The king was silent for a moment. "I'll ask you again," he said at last. "In a year?" She could have wept. He was true to his word. He asked the following year. She could not answer. He asked the year after. Still she could not. There was one shirt yet unfinished, and finishing it was worth everything she had. She willed her hands to move faster and found they would not be rushed. The final shirt was completed on a bright, early summer morning, 3 years after she had arrived at the castle, and 6 years after she had first begun. She was done. She gathered all 6 shirts in her arms. She thought of her brothers, who did not know where she was. She thought of the little house in the forest, and whether they still went there at sunset. And then she thought of the golden yarn ball in her pocket, where it had been all this time. That night, when the moon was high and the castle was quiet, she slipped out through a side door and dropped the yarn ball on the ground. It rolled. She followed it through the castle gardens and down the streets of the town and out through the walled gate and into the forest. Oh, through the long dark hours, the thread unrolling before her, and the moonlight lighting her way. By morning, she was standing in the hollow outside the small cottage. She went in and rested when the sun was lower in Nesky, and she had woken from a deep and grateful sleep. She went outside with the shirts in her arms and sat down in the clearing to wait. And then the king rode into the clearing. He had followed her golden thread from the castle to the forest and through the trees for miles, because he was not a man who gave up easily either. "I've come to ask you one more time," he said as he dismounted, and his voice was careful and slightly hopeful and genuinely vulnerable in a way that made her chest ache. "I said it would be the last. If you still cannot break your silence, I will take you home and say nothing more." And then he was distracted by the sound of wings. 6 enormous swans came sweeping into the clearing, landing around May in the long grass. She moved quickly. She had planned this, had held it in her mind for years. And she took a shirt and threw it over the neck of each swan in turn. The king watched, astonished, as the birds were transformed. One by one, then all at once, they stood in the warm afternoon light. 6 young men, tall and confused and blinking in the sunlight they had not felt on their human faces in 6 years. They stared at each other. They stared at their hands. Then they looked at May, and they understood, and there were tears streaming down all their faces. She turned to the king. He was looking at her with an expression of total incomprehension and total trust, and he sank to one knee. "Dear lady," he said, "will you now tell me your name and your answer?" May looked at him for a long moment. She felt the silence around her, the silence she had chosen and kept through years of loneliness and difficulty and love and waiting. It had done what it was supposed to do. It had saved her brothers. She smiled. "My name is May," she said, "and my answer is yes." After that, there was only happiness. The brothers were reunited with their parents, a reunion of such complete joy that it nearly broke the palace in two with the noise of it. May was married to the king in a wedding that people would talk about for years. Not because of the grandeur of it, though it was very grand, but because of the way the bride looked when she walked in, as though she had arrived at exactly the right place after a very long and worthwhile journey. It was said of her, in later years, that she was the most patient queen the kingdom had ever known, that she chose her words with extraordinary care, that she was a superb needlewoman, and that she was never, under any circumstances, to be underestimated. She also, it was noted, kept a particular fondness for daisies, growing them in every part of the castle garden in great sweeping drifts that caught the summer light and filled the courtyards with white and gold. Nobody who knew the reason for this ever needed to ask, what does it mean to live in a world without seasons? Imagine waking every morning of your life too white, too cold, to the familiar still weight of a world that has not changed since before you were born. That has not changed. In fact, since before your parents were born, and their parents before them. The people of that kingdom knew this. They had always known it. The cold was not something they complained about, because it was simply the shape of things, as unremarkable as the sky. They wore heavy clothes and built warm fires, and made their lives in the snow as cheerfully as anyone makes their life, in whatever world they happened to have been given. But the elders remembered. The grandparents and the great-grandparents spoke of it in the way that people speak of things they can no longer quite believe in themselves. The seasons: spring with its mud and its blossoms, summer with its overwhelming, unexpected heat, autumn with the trees on fire and the smell of something ending. The children listened and tried to picture it, the way you try to picture a color you have never seen described to you by someone else. They could not quite manage it. At the center of this frozen kingdom, in the middle of everything, stood a mountain. It was not a natural mountain. Even without being told, you would know that. It rose too abruptly from the landscape. Its surface had the wrong quality for rock or stone. It was too smooth, too brilliant, too completely without imperfection. It was, in fact, made of glass, or something so close to glass that the distinction hardly mattered. A vast, translucent, impenetrable peak of ice, so compressed and ancient, it had become something else entirely. It reflected the sky. In winter, which was always, it reflected silver and white and the pale gray of endless cloud. In the rare moments of winter sunshine, it blazed with a cold fire that could be seen for miles. At night, it held the moonlight in its surface and sent it back in sharp, bright beams. The mountain was the work of a sorcerer. So the stories said. The sorcerer had argued with the king of this place, a terrible argument, the kind that ends things permanently, and in his fury, he had created the mountain and cast the king and his daughter to its summit, stranding them there, in the highest, coldest, most unreachable place in the land. The eternal winter had arrived at the same time, a side effect of this spell, or perhaps its cause. No one had ever been entirely sure. The king, people said, had gone looking for the sorcerer long ago and never returned. The daughter remained at the top. Her name, the stories said, was Leona. And she had been there for a very long time, not aging, not changing, simply existing in the glass castle that sat at the frozen summit, waiting for what? Exactly. No one was quite sure. For someone to get to her, for someone to try. Many had tried. There was a tradition of it, actually. The adventurous, the hopeful, the romantically ambitious, the genuinely heroic, all of them had looked at that glittering peak at some point and thought, I could be the one. They had come equipped with axes, ice picks, ropes, ladders, pitons, grappling hooks, and in one memorable case, an elaborate contraption involving a system of pulleys that had taken 3 men 6 weeks to build and achieved an elevation of perhaps 40 feet before the whole thing came apart. The mountain defeated them all, not just because of its impossible surface, slick and featureless, and offering nothing to grip, but because of the bird. At some point in the ascent, without fail, a bird appeared, enormous, white, with a wingspan that blocked the sun and talons that could have lifted a horse. It came for everyone who climbed, diving and wheeling and driving them back down the mountain with the patient, relentless ferocity of something that was not simply a bird but a guardian, a warning, a force. Even those who had made serious progress, who had found a grip and held it against all odds, had to let go of their tools to defend themselves against the creature's attacks, and without their tools they slid. Ebergen slid. In the village at the foot of the mountain there was a boy named Jamie. He had grown up in the mountain's shadow, literally and figuratively. It was the view from every window, the shape that defined the horizon, the thing you measured everything else against. He had been ice skating on the village pond since he was old enough to stand on blades, and he had spent more winter evenings than he could count cutting smooth circles across the ice while the mountain blazed above him in the setting sun. It was clever, Jamie. His mother would say so, though usually in the anxious tone of someone who has realized that cleverness in a child is not always the unambiguous blessing one might hope for. He noticed things. He made connections. He had a particular quality of mental stillness that let him look at a problem from every direction before committing to a solution. And the problem of the glass mountain had been occupying his attention for quite some time. He had watched every attempt. He had noted what worked briefly, usually, and what did not work. He had thought about the bird and about what it meant that the bird appeared at a certain point in every climb, and about the relationship between a person's hands and their ability to stay on a glass surface. Des planètes was simply, it was possibly absurd, but it was his. One evening after supper, he sat at the table with his parents and told them he was going to use his ice skates to climb. Both parents looked at him for a while. His mother went first. "Jamie," she said carefully, "those skates are for ice, flat ice, not a vertical mountain of glass." "The mountain is covered in ice," Jamie said. "The blades will grip." "The mountain is covered in a perfectly smooth sheet of ice that nothing has ever gripped," his father pointed out. "The blades are thinner than anything else. They'll find something." "And the bird?" his mother said. "When the bird comes, as it always does, how will you defend yourself with your hands occupied?" "My hands won't be occupied," Jamie said. "That's the whole point." His parents looked at each other. This was the particular communication of parents of clever children. An entire conversation conducted in the space of a glance. "What gift will you bring her?" His mother tried. "I'll find something," Jamie said. There was a pause. "You're going," his father said. It was not a question. "Yes," said Jamie. By the next morning, somehow, the entire village knew. This was not surprising. Villages always. No, the news had moved through it in the way of all village news, whispered, elaborated, embroidered, and delivered with such speed and certainty that by the time Jamie set out the next day, most of the village had assembled at a respectful distance to watch. He tried not to notice them. He packed a loaf of bread and a bottle of water in his rucksack. He tied his ice skates together and draped them over his shoulder. He put his head down and walked toward the mountain. The path to the mountain's base was silent around him. except for the sound of his boots in the packed snow, meditative rhythm that settled his thoughts and calmed the flutter in his chest. He breathed in the cold air, clean and sharp and enormous, the kind of air that goes all the way down and reminds you that you are alive. And then he was there. The mountain rose before him, a sheer, perfect, terrible wall of glass. No foothold, no variation in the surface. Just a vast, smooth, blinding face of ice going straight up into the sky. Jamie sat on a large rock and put on his skates. He stood up. He turned to face the mountain, and without allowing himself to hesitate, he took his first step. The blade of his skate found the surface and did not immediately slide. It bit just barely, just enough. He shifted his weight carefully, then lifted his other foot and placed it slightly higher. He began to climb. It was slow. It was tremendously slow. Each step required absolute precision and absolute patience. Place the blade, feel the tiny purchase, shift the weight, lift the other foot, feel for the next hold. He kept his body close to the surface of the mountain, leaning into it, his hands spread against the ice for balance, without relying on them for grip. The village faded below him and behind him. The cold air intensified as he rose, wrapping around his head and shoulders in a constant, piercing wind. His fingers went numb. The light reflecting off the mountain's surface was extraordinary, blinding, crystalline, 100,000 reflections of the winter sun multiplying themselves into an almost unbearable brightness. He did not look down. He did not look up. He simply climbed. Time lost its shape entirely. He had no idea how long he had been on the mountain. The rhythm of his ascent was everything. Place, grip, shift, lift. Place, grip, shift, lift. The village was gone. The world was gone. There was only the mountain and the sound of his own breathing and the faint, deliberate scratch of blades on ice. And then he heard it. A sound above the wind, a piercing, distant cry that grew closer as it grew louder. He turned his face upward. Out of the brilliant white sky, a shadow came diving at him with appalling speed. The bird was enormous, white feathers and a wingspan that blocked the sky above him. Its talons were forward thrust and its eyes were fixed on him with the cold, focused fury of something that had done this many times before and was very good at it. Jamie pressed himself against the mountain and waited. His blades held. The bird hit him in a flurry of wings, beating around his head, his face, his shoulders, pushing him sideways. He dug his blades in harder and bent double under the assault. He could feel the wind of each wing beat, like a physical blow. The creature was trying to destabilize him, to push him just far enough off balance that he would slide. He straightened. He looked up at the bird above him. He raised both hands, and he grabbed its legs. The bird shrieked. It flapped. It wheeled. It beat its enormous wings with a fury and a power that sent ice crystals spraying from the surface of the mountain in a glittering cascade. And then, apparently deciding that the only solution to this problem was to remove it, it flew upward. Yomi held on. It was rising. His skates scraped off the mountain's surface, and then he was simply in the air, held up by nothing but the grip of his own hands around the legs of an enormous, furious, extremely put-upon bird. The ground below him dropped away with a dizzying speed. The cold wind roared in his ears. He screwed his eyes shut and then couldn't help it opened them. The mountain was below him. The village was far, far below the mountain. The landscape stretched out in every direction, a vast white quilt of snow and ice, laced with dark lines of forest and the gray threads of frozen rivers, punctuated by the tiny miniature shapes of houses and roads and other lives going quietly about their business. Unaware that a boy was currently airborne and climbing, it was the most extraordinary thing he had ever seen. The bird carried him upward, its wings working with extraordinary power, rising with him until the summit of the mountain was below them, and then, with what might have been a certain exasperated exhaustion, it banked and swept low over the flat expanse of the mountain's peak. Jamie let go. He landed hard and rolled, and for a moment the whole world rang like a struck bell. When his wits returned, he was sitting in the largest bird's nest he had ever seen. An enormous structure built from branches and frost in the center of a golden tree. A single tree standing alone on the white summit in a world of ice, its branches bare but somehow luminous, its bark the color of honey, every branch tipped with gold, and in the center of the nest, half buried in frost and ice, an egg the size of his rucksack. Solid gold in the pale winter light, the shell of it had a shimmering depth that made it look less like a thing and more like a concentrated source of something, warmth or light or the slow ancient energy that warms the world from underneath. Jamie looked at the egg for a long time. He looked around for the bird. The sky above the nest was clear. The bird, apparently, had decided it had done quite enough for one day. He reached into his rucksack and took out his water bottle. He uncapped it carefully, then tipped the lukewarm water, not warm, but warmer than the mountain, slowly over the base of the egg. The ice coating began to contract and run. It poured more. The frost gave way. The golden surface emerged, pristine and extraordinary. He took the egg in his hands. It moved just slightly, and then, with a resistance that gave way all at once like a key turning in a lock, it came free. It was heavier than he had expected. He nestled it carefully in his rucksack alongside his boots. The bird returned. He heard it before he saw it, that same approaching cry, urgent now, and unmistakably coming back for its egg. He had seconds. He reached into his rucksack. The bread. He still had his bread. As the bird swept down and its talons reached for him, Jamie pushed the loaf upward into its grip. The bird seized it, flapped triumphantly, sailed away into the white sky, clutching its prize. Jamie sat very still and breathed. When the bird was gone, he put on his boots, draped his skates over his shoulder, stood up carefully in the nest, and looked out over the summit of the glass mountain. In the far distance, catching the light, something flashed. He climbed down from the nest. He settled the rucksack carefully on his back, and he began to walk. The summit of the mountain was a world of its own, flat and white and bitterly cold, with a sky above it that felt somehow closer than it should. He walked for a long time across the ice, breathing carefully in the thin air, shielding his eyes against the unrelenting brightness. And then the castle appeared. It rose from the ice like a dream of architecture, towers and turrets and buttresses of glass, sculpted into shapes that had no equivalent in any building he had seen in the village below. It was enormous and impossibly delicate at once. every surface reflecting the sky around it, the interior lit by some cold internal luminescence that made it glow from within, even in the gray light. As the sun moved lower, the glass caught the warm colors of the approaching evening and held them, orange, amber, the deep rose of the last light. The castle blazed with it. He crossed the drawbridge, frozen solid across a moat of ice that glittered below him, and stood before two enormous doors. Knocked. The sound of it echoed through the glass structure in a way that was extraordinary, not merely loud, but crystalline, the sound branching and rebranching through the castle like light through a prism. He heard it reach into every corner of the place. He waited, and then, slowly, the door began to open. It opened from the bottom first, pushed by someone inside, working hard at it, and by the time it was open enough for a person to stand in, Jamie was looking at a young woman who was working very hard indeed. She was wearing a heavy cloak over a plain white dress, a knitted blue muffler wound twice around her neck, and a pair of woolly earmuffs that were, he had to admit, extremely practical for this altitude. She had the look of someone who has been managing an extremely difficult situation for an extremely long time and has developed a kind of clear-eyed competence about it that sits somewhere between determination and exhaustion. She looked at him with wide, steady eyes. He looked at her, then she asked, very directly, who exactly she was. It told here. It told he was from the village at the foot of the mountain, and he had come, if she was agreeable, to rescue. He was aware, the moment he said it, that he looked somewhat less heroic than the word implied. He was carrying a pair of ice skates and a rucksack that now contained a very large golden egg. He had not, now that he thought about it, given any attention to the question of how he would get back down the mountain. Her expression was polite but reserved. Then he said, I brought you something, actually. Can I show you inside? And that, finally, was the right thing to say. She stepped back. Stepped in. The interior of the castle was cold. This should not have been surprising. The princess, who introduced herself as Leona with the brisk clarity of someone who has not had the opportunity for introductions in quite some time, stood in the hall and watched him open the rucksack and carefully lift out the golden egg. Her expression changed entirely. She took it from him with both hands and turned it slowly, examining it in the dim, refracted light of the hall. As he told her how he had found it, the nest, the bird, the lukewarm water, something shifted in her face, a kind of recognition, a dawning of something she had perhaps suspected for a long time. The bird, she said slowly. I've seen it, always, from the windows, flying around the peak. She paused. I think it might be the sorcerer. They stood with this thought for a moment. My father went looking for him, she said, more quietly. He never came back. Jamie did not know what to say to that. He expressed his sympathy. She accepted it with a small nod and then looked back at the egg. It's warm, she said. He looked. She was right. The egg had been warming since she took it, and now it was glowing faintly, a deepening gold that pulsed gently like something breathing. Leona set it on the stone floor. They stepped back. The glow intensified. The hall filled with warm golden light, not the cold light of glass and snow, but something else entirely, something that came from inside the earth and remembered summer. The air in the hall which had been the temperature of January, began to shift. Leona unwound her muffler. Jamie found himself sweating. The walls began to drip. The ice creaking and cracking as the warmth spread outward from the castle's center in concentric rings. They stood on the ice shelf beyond the moat and turned to watch. The glass castle was melting. From the inside, the towers softened and slumped. The turrets ran. The walls lost their angles and became shapes, and then impressions, and then nothing. From the ruins, a pillar of golden light shot upward into the darkening sky like a signal fire, and out of it enormous, blazing, trailing light from every feather came a bird, not the cold white eagle. This was something else entirely. Vast and burning and magnificent, it spread its wings against the evening sky, and the light from its feathers fell across the mountainside in rivers of warmth. The snow began to melt off the mountain, Jamie said. Right now, the ice beneath their feet was already running in rivulets. The glass surface of the slope was dissolving, streaming downward in sheets of water. In a few minutes there would be nothing to stand on. He had a rucksack and a pair of ice skates. He had one idea. He dropped the skates on the ice. "Hold on to me," he told Leona, tightly. She looked at him. She looked at the burning bird overhead, which was banking in a long, slow curve and coming back toward them. She linked her arms around his neck as the phoenix swept low above them. Jamie reached up and grabbed its legs. This time the bird did not fight him. It rose smoothly, deliberately, carrying them both up and away from the peak as the mountain streamed and melted below them. The phoenix's feathers were warm, not burning, just warm, like holding your hands near a fire. The wind in their faces was extraordinary and fierce. They went down the mountain. Fast. The mountain flashed by below them, streams of water racing down what had been a glass surface and was now, somehow, rock and earth, and the beginning of something that might, in time, become soil. The ice was going. The winter was going. When their feet touched the ground, they fell and lay in the wet snow at the foot of the mountain, looking up at the sky. The Fina called once from high above them, a sound like every summer morning that had ever existed, compressed into one long triumphant note, and then curved away over the trees, trailing sparks that drifted down like the warmest kind of rain. Leona and Jamie looked at each other, and they laughed. They laughed until they had to hold each other upright. They laughed the way you laugh when something has been impossibly frightening and is now impossibly over. They laughed until the tears on their cheeks were cold and the snow beneath them was soaking through, and it didn't matter at all. It was raining by the time they reached the village. Warm rain. The first warm rain anyone there had felt in generations, and it fell on upturned faces and open hands, and people stood in the streets and let it soak them to the skin and did not go inside. By morning, the world had changed. The snow was melting. The rivers were moving. Underneath the retreating white, the earth appeared dark and damp and alive, breathing out the cold it had been holding for so long. By afternoon there was mud, and then the pale suggestion of green. And then, over the days and weeks and months that followed, everything the elders had spent their lives trying to describe, the children learned the names for things: crocuses, birdsong, the smell of rain on warm earth, the exact quality of June light at 7 in the evening. Jamie, who had grown up with ice skates and a clever mind and a plan that was almost ridiculously simple, found that he had brought Sprain back to an entire kingdom. He asked Leona to marry him in the first summer, standing in a field of wildflowers he had never seen before, holding a bouquet of every color he had been told about and was now, finally, seeing with his own eyes. Yes, of course she did. They had, after all, already held on to each other through everything. Evie was no exception. She had passed through that particular door, the garden gnome on the front lawn that had once seemed to watch her go by, had been reclassified as a piece of ceramic, still and silent. The dragonfly she had once mistaken for a fairy had been reclassified as a dragonfly. Magic, she had decided, belonged to books and to the soft, gauzy territory of very early childhood. And she was past that now. She still loved the woods, though that had nothing to do with magic. She told herself it was just nature. And nature was simply what it was. And autumn in the woods was something she would never stop loving, because there was nothing in the world quite like it. She told her mother this on the afternoon in question, before she put on her coat and her grandmother's hand-knitted hat and set out for her walk. "It's sensory magic," she said, meaning it to sound like a rational, grounded observation about the combined effect of color and texture and smell, and not noticing quite the word she had chosen. Her mother smiled and waved her off. The woods received her as they always did. The path crunched beneath her boots in the particular satisfying way of autumn paths, where the fallen leaves have dried just enough to crumble under pressure, but not so much that they blow away before you get to step on them. Above her, the canopy was extraordinary. The trees had done their most extravagant thing, turning themselves into something that looked designed specifically to take your breath away. Amber, copper, burnt orange, deep, vivid, red. The gray sky behind them should have dampened the effect, but it didn't. If anything, the muted light made the colors more intense, as though the trees were their own source of illumination. She walked and looked up and breathed deeply. The smell of wet leaves and pine and cold air and distant wood smoke filled her lungs like something necessary. She was not looking at the path, which was why she did not notice, at first, that it had changed. What she noticed was the sound, or rather, the absence of the sound she expected. The soft crunch of leaves on earth, replaced by something else. A tap, a click, a harder sound. She looked down. The dirt path was gone. Under her feet was cobblestone, smooth, closely fitted, old. On either side of the path, red maple trees stood in tight rows, their branches interlacing above her, and the dense shrubs between them formed walls that left her no option but forward or back. She looked back. The familiar path had gone. Behind her was only the ordinary forest, grass, leaves, trees, but no track, no way back that she could see. The cobblestone was only ahead. Evie stood still. She did what sensible people do when they encounter something unexpected. She thought about it. She could try to push back through the ordinary forest and find her way home. She could follow the path and see where it went. She could stand here indefinitely, which seemed the least useful option. Something inside her, a feeling she could not quite name, somewhere between curiosity and a peculiar sense of rightness, pointed firmly toward the cobblestone. She walked. The path was smooth under her boots. The maple trees on either side were gorgeous up close, their leaves the deepest red she had ever seen, some already drifting down in slow, unhurried spirals. She watched her own feet for a moment. Then she looked up again and stopped. On the cobblestone, in the middle of the path, was a small figure about the size of her finger. Green, winged. She looked at him. He looked at her. She blinked. She rubbed her eyes, which she later felt was a very reasonable thing to do. She looked again. He was still there. She shook her head, the way you shake a snow globe to see if the snow resets. She squeezed her eyes shut and counted to 3 and reopened them. Still there. Still green. Still watching her with an expression of frank curiosity. She stepped back, and her boot caught on a cobblestone, and she went backwards, and then something wrapped around her waist. She caught her breath. It held her firm and smooth and solid, and then set her carefully on her feet. When she turned to look, it was a branch from the red maple beside the path, drawn back to its usual position, looking like an entirely ordinary branch. "Thank you," she said, "because what else do you say to a tree that has just caught you?" The branch waved, not in the wind, just waved. Evie took a very careful breath. She turned back to the path. The air above the cobblestones was full of fairies, not one, not a few, many of them hovering in the afternoon light, their wings moving in a range of colors she had never seen on any living thing. Teal, copper gold, the most vivid purple, the most improbable yellow, a particular iridescent green that seemed to contain every color at once. They were the size of her hand, and they were looking at her with expressions that ranged from cautious to delighted to the particular expression of someone who has not had a visitor in a very long time, and is not quite sure what the protocol is. "Hello," Evie said, because it seemed like the place to start. The fairies exchanged glances. A murmur went through them. One of them floated slightly forward from the group, slightly larger than the others, her wings catching the light in a way that was distinctly different, gold-edged and luminous. She had brown hair and a yellow dress, and an expression of composed authority. "You've managed to find us?" this fairy said. Her voice was clear and small, perfectly pitched for the scale of her. The trees don't often allow it. "I wasn't looking for anything in particular," Evie said. "I was just walking." "Yes," said the fairy, as if this were the expected answer. "That is usually how it works." Behind her, several of the other fairies appeared to relax. The wari's expressions faded. A few of the smaller fairies had begun to drift closer, drawn by curiosity. "I'm Evie," Evie said. The fairy inclined her head. "My name is Marigold," she said. "I am the queen here." Evie looked at her, then beyond her. The cobblestone path continued toward a gap in the maple trees where something else was visible, the corner of a small building. Tiny but distinct, the angle of a roof, the shape of a door. "Would you like to see?" Marigold asked. "Very much," Evie said. The 2 willow trees at the end of the maple avenue drew back their branches as Evie approached, as though they had been expecting her. She stepped through a curtain of trailing leaves, and the air changed. It was warm, not the cool autumn of the woods she had walked through, summer warm, the full, generous, unhurried warmth of July, of long evenings and bare arms and the smell of cut grass. Evie immediately regretted her hat and scarf, which her grandmother had made with considerable dedication and which were now uncomfortably perfect for a different season. Before her was a village, the smallest village she had ever seen. Cobblestone paths wound between buildings, sized for creatures no bigger than her hand. In the center of the main path, rising to perhaps her waist, stood a handsome stone building, cream-colored, solid, with a large clock face embedded in its front wall. The clock's hands said it was almost tea time. She should have been home some time ago. But around her, fairies were moving through their village with the purposeful ease of a community going about its business. Some carried things she recognized: leaves, acorns, small pieces of wood. Others carried things that had no equivalent in her world. Squirrels moved through the streets, pushing tiny wooden trolleys loaded with fairies and goods. There were open-air cafes, proper ones, with tables and chairs, and something cooking on fires smaller than a candle flame. There was a clay-fronted shop with a handwritten sign advertising tea and coffee. Evie stared at the sign. Marigold appeared at her shoulder. "We visit your world," she said simply, as though this answered everything. Then, before Evie could say anything, "We have a great deal of work to do today. Would you like to help?" "Yes," said Evie immediately. "Then come." A fairy with teal wings and ocean blue eyes fluttered up beside Evie and explained in a small and precise voice that she was building a house and needed materials. Would Evie help collect them? They went about the business of it together. Evie, searching for suitable twigs and leaves and fallen acorns, handing them down carefully to the fairy, who assessed each one with a professional eye and accepted or rejected it with quiet decisiveness. Then they walked together to the building site, past the clock tower and the cafes and the squirrels with their trolleys. Evie watched, squatting as low as she could to see properly, as the fairy assembled the materials with astonishing skill. She used a length of thread, not ordinary thread, but something that glittered faintly as it moved to bind the twigs together, and as the thread worked it seemed to fuse the materials as though they had always been joined. The leaves became curtains, shaped and draped to catch the light. Small stones, broken apart with a tool the size of a thumbnail, became a table and chairs. Acorn cups became bowls. By the time the little clock struck 4, the house was complete. Marigold came to find Evie as the afternoon was ending. She did not need to ask whether Evie should go. The girl was already standing and brushing leaves from her knees, understanding that she had stayed as long as she should. They walked back through the village to the cobblestone path. As Evie turned to leave, Marigold touched her cheek, the briefest, most delicate touch, and said, "Open your hand." A fairy with purple wings fluttered forward and dropped something small and light onto Evie's palm. Evie closed her hand around it without looking. She walked back through the willows. The maple avenue closed around her and the cobblestone path unrolled before her boots. And the autumn air of the real world settled back over her shoulders with a cool and ordinary embrace. The path became dirt. The trees became regular trees. She walked home with her hand still closed. She did not open it until she was standing outside her own front door, because some things are worth waiting for. In her palm was a small twig. Simple, unremarkable, except that in the wood, in letters made of golden shimmer, were 4 words: honorary guardian fairy, Evie. She held it for a long time, then she carried it inside and ate dinner and had a long bath and got into bed. She put the twig under her pillow. She looked up at the moon through the gap in her curtains. She made a wish. She fell asleep. She dreamed of gold letters in the grain of a twig and of a village where squirrels pushed trolleys and fairy queens wore yellow and the air smelled of July in October. She dreamed of a purple-winged fairy dropping something small and significant into her open palm. She dreamed of a red maple tree waving its branch in a way that was unmistakably friendly. Under her pillow, the twig glowed, and even in her sleep, Evie knew she would go back. Tilda. The Fairy Forest. Part 2. In the morning, she woke up to sunlight. It came through the gap in her curtains, the way sunlight always does on clear mornings, insistent, golden. Exactly the quality of light that makes staying in bed feel difficult. She turned toward it for a moment, blinking. The sounds of the house filtered up through the floor. The coffee machine, her mother's voice, her father's deeper answering laugh. She reached for her memories of the night before. They were fuzzy in the way of dreams, that particular softness at the edges that makes you feel as though you are trying to hold water in your hands. She remembered wings. She remembered a clock tower that came up to her waist. She remembered a village so small it looked like something built for play. She sat up. She stretched. She was about to swing her legs out of bed. And then she saw the hat on the floor, her grandmother's hat, mustard yellow, knitted with love and the kind of determination that only grandmothers who knit in front of the television at speed have. It was lying on the carpet where she had dropped it the night before, and it was full of the woods, green moss, small twigs, crumbled brown leaves caught in the weave. The sort of debris that accumulates in clothing when you have been walking through a forest, actually walking through it, not just passing along a path. She pulled it into her lap. She turned it over in her hands, embedded in the yarn, so fine they were almost invisible until the light caught them at the right angle, were small, silver gold specks, tiny, numerous. Absolutely, unmistakably not dust, not lint, not any ordinary thing at all. Fairy dust. She sat for a long time with the hat in her lap. Then she looked out through the window. From her bedroom she could see the woods. They were right there. A short walk from her front door, ordinary and familiar in the way that things are ordinary and familiar right up until they reveal themselves to be something else entirely. A light breeze was moving through the trees, lifting the leaves in a way that was entirely normal, except that in one part of the canopy, the movement was different. Not the gentle, random sway of wind-moved branches, but something more deliberate, more unified. The way branches move when the trees behind them are paying attention. Evie watched. The movement stopped. The woods were still. She got dressed very quickly. She told her mother good morning and moved around the kitchen, collecting supplies with the focus of someone who has a plan and would like to execute it while the plan is still fresh. Granola bars, an apple, a bottle of water, air, rucksack, her wellies, because it had rained overnight and the ground in the woods would be soft and giving. Her mother watched all of this with the equanimity of a woman who has learned not to ask questions until the right moment. Back for dinner, she said. Definitely, Evie said. I'm just going for a walk. She left the house. The morning was clean and bright, the kind of autumn Sunday that has been washed by the previous night rained into something vivid and new, the bark on the trees darker and richer. The leaves glossy, the smell of everything intensified as though the world had been turned up slightly on all its dials. Even the light seemed more present. She walked through the quiet streets toward the woods. Sunday morning had spread its particular calm over the neighborhood. A woman being pulled along by a large, enthusiastic German shepherd, a couple visible through a window sharing breakfast. A family gathered around a kitchen table, the world in its small, comfortable, Sunday configuration. The woods rose at the end of the road. She went in. The smell of wet earth and pine and damp leaves enveloped her immediately. Strong and completely wonderful, the rain had given everything a quality of heightened aliveness. The moss on the tree trunks glowed deep green. The puddles along the path reflected the sky above. The fallen leaves were brilliant in their wet colors. She walked and ate her apple. She did not look at the path. She looked up the way she had the day before, letting the canopy fill her vision. She breathed. She paid attention. Once upon a time, in a small town nestled between rolling green hills and a sprawling, ancient forest, lived a girl named Evie. Evie wasn't like the other kids her age. While they were busy with video games and social media, Evie was a dreamer, a wanderer, her head always full of stories about magical creatures and hidden worlds. Her favorite place on earth was the Whispering Woods, the very forest that bordered her town. The locals said it was enchanted, a place where the veil between worlds was thin. For Evie, it was simply home. Every afternoon, she'd venture into its depths, a sketchbook and a handful of colored pencils tucked into her worn backpack. She'd draw the gnarled trees that looked like sleeping giants, the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy, and the peculiar, brightly colored mushrooms that grew in perfect circles. People called them fairy rings, and Evie, with her boundless imagination, believe it, Tim, she'd often sit in the center of these rings, close her eyes, and whisper, "I'm here. I believe in you. Can you see me?" But the forest only ever answered with the rustle of leaves and the distant call of a bird. One particularly warm summer evening, as the sun began its descent, casting long, dancing shadows across the forest floor, Evie found a new path. It was a trail she'd never noticed before, almost hidden behind a curtain of weeping willow branches. Curiosity, as it always did, got the better of her. She pushed aside the branches and stepped onto a path paved not with dirt, but with smooth, glowing pebbles that pulsed with a soft, ethereal light. The air grew still, and a gentle humming sound, like the beat of 1,000 tiny wings, filled her ears. As they walked, the forest around her began to transform. The familiar oak and pine trees gave way to trees with silver bark and leaves that shimmered with all the colors of the rainbow. Flowers she had never seen bloomed in impossible hues, releasing a sweet, intoxicating fragrance into the air. Fireflies, larger and brighter than any she'd ever witnessed, danced around her, their lights blinking in a synchronized, mesmerizing rhythm. Evie's heart pounded in her chest, a mix of fear and exhilarating excitement. This was it. This was the magic she had been searching for. The path ended at a clearing, and what she saw there made her gasp. In the center of the clearing stood a colossal tree, its trunk so wide it would take 20 people to encircle it. Its branches reached up to the sky, adorned not with leaves, but with glowing crystal fruits, and all around it, fluttering in the twilight, were them, the fairies. They were just as she'd imagined, and yet so much more. Some were tiny, no bigger than her thumb, with delicate wings like stained glass. Others were taller, more human-like, with pointed ears and clothes woven from flower petals and moonlight. They darted through the air, their laughter like the chiming of tiny bells. They tended to the glowing flowers, drank dew from acorn cups, and painted the wings of butterflies with stardust. It was a world buzzing with life, color, and pure, undiluted magic. Evie stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, hidden by the foliage, too stunned to move. She watched as a group of fairies gathered around a pool of crystal clear water. One of them, a fairy with hair the color of spun gold and a dress made of morning glory petals, dipped her hands into the water. As she lifted them, the water droplets solidified into sparkling jewels, which she then carefully placed on a spider web, making it glitter like a diamond necklace. Suddenly, a small fairy with bright blue wings zipped right past Evie's nose, stopping abruptly. It hovered before her, its tiny head tilted in curiosity, its eyes, like two tiny black beads, stared into hers. Evie held her breath. The little creature then let out a high-pitched giggle and flew straight towards the giant tree, shouting in a voice that sounded like wind chimes, "A visitor! We have a visitor." Instantly, all activity in the clearing ceased. Hundreds of pairs of eyes turned towards Evie. The humming stopped. The air became thick with silence. Evie felt her cheeks flush, her hands growing clammy. She thought about running, about turning back the way she came, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. Then a figure emerged from the base of the great tree. She was taller than the other fairies, radiating an aura of wisdom and gentle authority. Her hair was long and silver, braided with starlight, and her eyes held the depth of the night sky. She wore a gown that seemed woven from the mist of a waterfall. This, Evie knew instinctively, was the queen. The fairy queen glided towards Evie, her movements fluid and graceful. She stopped just a few feet away, her expression unreadable. "You are a child of the human world," she said, her voice soft yet resonant, echoing through the clearing. "It has been a long time since one of your kind has found their way to Eradale. You do not carry fear or greed in your heart, only wonder. Why are you here, child?" Finding her voice, Evie stammered, I've always believed in you. I just wanted to see if you were real." A slow smile spread across the queen's face, a smile that seemed to make the very flowers around her bloom brighter. "Belief is a powerful key, Evie," she said, somehow knowing her name. "It unlocks doors that others cannot see. You did not just stumble upon our world, your heart led you here." The queen then waved her hand, and the clearing once again filled with the gentle hum of activity. The fairies, no longer wary, began to fly around Evie, their curiosity piqued. One braided a tiny, glowing flower into her hair. Another offered her a drop of nectar from a honeysuckle, and it tasted sweeter than anything she had ever imagined. For what felt like hours, Evie stayed in it. She learned that the glowing pebbles on the path were called moonstones, and they only lit the way for those with pure intentions. She discovered that the great tree was the heartwood, the source of all magic in their realm. The fairies showed her how they guided the seasons, how they whispered dreams into the ears of sleeping children, and how they cared for every living thing in the forest, from the largest bear to the smallest beetle. They weren't just mischievous sprites from storybooks. They were guardians, caretakers of the natural world. They explained that their world and the human world were two sides of the same coin, intrinsically linked. When humans cared for nature, their world thrived. When nature was harmed, their magic weakened. As the moon climbed high into the sky, the fairy queen approached Evie again. "It is time for you to return," she said gently. "But the path will always be open to you now. You are a friend of Arid." She then plucked one of the crystal fruits from the heartwood and placed it in Evie's hand. It was warm and pulsed with a soft, steady light, a small piece of our magic to remind you that what you saw tonight was real, and to remind you of your purpose. "My purpose?" Evie asked, confused. "You are a bridge, Evie," the queen explained. "A bridge between our worlds. Help your people remember the magic they have forgotten. Help them see the wonder in a single leaf, the life in a drop of water. Help them care for the world, for in doing so, they care for us and for themselves." With a heavy heart, Evie said her goodbyes. The fairies waved their tiny, glowing hands as she walked back down the path of moonstones. When she pushed aside the willow branches and stepped back into her own world, the magical glow faded, and the forest was once again the familiar, quiet, whispering woods. But it wasn't the same. Not for Evie. She looked down at the crystal fruit in her hand. It was still glowing, a warm, comforting light against her palm. She knew this wasn't the end of her adventure. It was just the beginning. She was no longer just Evie, the girl who dreamed of magic. She was Evie, the friend of fairies, the guardian of the woods, the bridge between two worlds. And she had a very important job to do. From that day on, her drawings weren't just of trees and flowers. They were filled with the light and life she now knew existed just beyond the veil, waiting for others to believe. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this magical journey, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you never miss another story. Until next time, keep searching for the magic in your own world. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of your night. May you find deep peace and restful sleep. Wishing you the sweetest dreams. If you liked it, please like, comment, and subscribe. Bye.